televised event around 3:30 today, in which Taylor Swift is going to make an appearance, and so I don't want to miss that. My sermon is of an appropriate length to make sure everyone can get to go home. I want to thank, though, Allegra and Dan and Jeremy and Cam and anyone else who helped. Charlie and Jean also helped, and I know I'm missing people. For providing pancakes. It's an old tradition, as you know, that in the Christian church, the Sunday or in the days before the season of Lent begins, that you eat up all the fatty things in the home. We won't be following that practice at our house, but anyway, it's a Shrove, often called Shrove Tuesday, or in this case, Shrove Sunday, or Fat Tuesday, or Mardi Gras. And you've probably heard of Mardi Gras. We won't be doing anything like that. But we will be Ash Wednesday service, and I want to encourage you to come. It's going to be 8 a.m., and we'll have, it's a brief service. We will share in communion and impose ashes on our foreheads that you can wear all day long and impress people as you go around to the grocery store. So you might have noticed I included an attachment to everyone's bulletin today. There are two illustrations. You may have seen these before. The first is an image of a lovely young lady, apparently from the Victorian era. Or if you stare at this image long enough, your perspective of what it depicts can change. And instead you see the image of an older woman. This one's kind of tough. Or you may start out seeing that image of the older woman first, and then the young lady appears. It just depends. The second example is an image of two faces in silhouette staring at each other from a few inches apart. But if you look at that image long enough, and those silhouettes just become empty space, and the space between them emerges as a vase. Or again, you might see the vase first and then the faces. There's no right way, there's no wrong way to see these images. They are what they are. They are simply lines on a page. Those images are not changing at all. It's our perception that shifts. So the point of those illustrations is the fact that what we believe that we see as objective reality can change. Two people witnessing the same thing or the same event and come away with very different interpretations. With those optical illusion illustrations and with everyday events, it's almost as if our brain shifts gears as we transition between one way of seeing an image to another way of seeing the very same thing. So the meaning of an experience also changes based on what we choose to focus on and how we choose to perceive whatever it is that we're witnessing. And yet, we regularly label things as reality. Of course, we couldn't function without doing that. If I'm driving, I know I need to keep my car on the highway and below a certain speed to safely navigate a hairpin turn on a mountain road. Otherwise, I'll fly off the road, and cars are not constructed to be airborne. Any scientists or engineers in the room, and I know we have many, would be quick to point out that there are certain laws in the universe that are true, and no amount of staring at them will ever cause a shift in perspective. We usually think that there are some things like math and like physics that can be looked at correctly in only one way, and that reliability dictates natural laws and limits, like how tall you can possibly build a skyscraper and why cars cannot fly. At least those laws are absolutely true all the time until physicists like Albert Einstein or Richard Feynman come along and tell us that the reality that we once took for granted has shifted to reveal something new. Now, still, in the meantime, we need to have things we can count on to make sense of life. It's good to have laws that govern the physical world, and we call those rules our reality. The tricky part in all this is you and me. We tend to measure ourselves and other people by how they behave and what that behavior says about a person's beliefs, values, intelligence. And that makes sense because we all need to be able to rely on ourselves. We all need to be able to rely on one another. When we cannot count on someone to be reliable, when we don't know the next thing that they're likely to do or say, we might assume that person suffering from a cognitive illness or injury of some kind. We might say that person is divorced from reality. At its best, our ability to anticipate what most people will do in any given situation can help us diagnose and treat cognitive and behavioral problems. But on the other hand, our need for reliability in ourselves and in other people can sometimes limit us. At its worst, it can make us believe that people don't have the capacity to change. That's why we have horrible saying like, you can't teach a dog new tricks. Or it can mean that when we see a man who appears to be disheveled, we can jump to the conclusion that, oh, there goes a homeless person. For some folks, it could mean that when they're boarding a flight, they can become very nervous as their passengers come on board who are speaking Arabic. It can mean that people who speak with a Southern accent can be often regarded by others as uneducated bumpkins. For some people, it can mean that those who are gay are understood to be morally deficient somehow. But now we're getting into the realm of prejudice and bias. For the reality that we're seeing on the page, the image is not, in our way of perceiving reality, capable of shifting to something else. The story of the transfiguration of Jesus has long been a mystery, not only about what it depicts exactly, but even about what it means. It appears in 3 of the 4 Gospels, and it follows the same basic pattern in all 3. Jesus takes 3 of his most trusted lieutenants up a mountain where they see Jesus transformed in a way that really defies description. Jesus seems to glow, even his clothes turn a dazzling white. He's recognizable, yet different somehow. A cloud descends on the scene, a callback perhaps to the mountain where Moses received the 10 Commandments. Other famous biblical characters, including Moses, but also Elijah, appear right by his side and talk with Jesus. So, what does their appearance mean? Does Jesus have the same heavenly stature that they occupy? Or is it that he's carrying on the torch of Moses, the great lawgiver, and Elijah, the great prophet? And the 3 disciples then hear a booming voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. And the disciples are terrified. And when it's all over, Jesus swears the disciples to silence about this whole episode. And because the story is told from a third person perspective, we don't know what the disciples were experiencing, how they took all of this, but I think it must come close, very close, to experience a shift in perspective. From understanding who Jesus was, a very gifted human being and a charismatic teacher, to now see something else and say, same person, same shape and outline, same lines on the page, so to speak, but now very different. Clearly, they now saw holiness, the sacred, the symbols of the very presence of God. That setting, up high on a mountain, that cloud, that glow, the lawgiver and the prophet, and that voice, all were signs pointing to a new way of perceiving who Jesus was. Now, for those of us who are interested in modern ways of studying scripture, where we often parse out what really must have happened in a passage from what was probably imagined or was derived from legend, there's no doubt that this story, for most modern scholars, falls into the latter category. Just the same, the story is there for a reason. So our job is not to debate its historical accuracy, as it is to put on our sacred thinking caps and imagine what this story means. Over the years, I've come to at least one conclusion, and I'm not saying it's the only one, but I do think it's pretty good. And it helps me understand not only what the transfiguration means, but what the entire life of Jesus means. So if we hover above all the stories about Jesus, all that he said, all that he did, one consistent theme emerges when I stare long enough at that image of Jesus on the page. And it's expressed very well in the opening verses of John's gospel when he writes that the word became flesh. It's the idea that God took on human form in the person of Jesus, and that's nothing new. And we often assume, from our vantage point of 2,000 years later, that of course that's true, that Jesus was the human embodiment of God. And, we celebrate that every year at Christmas. And we're taught that that is what made Jesus absolutely unique. The idea, the doctrine is never before in human history has God taken on human form. Now, of course, for Jews and for a lot of other people, that was a radical, scandalous, even sacrilegious claim to be making. But the transfiguration story is a perfect example of that belief. There on that mountain, you have Jesus being revealed, at least to a few witnesses, as embodying the holiness of God. So the lesson seems to be Jesus was not merely a wise teacher and a healer. God was in Jesus. And if God was in him, then Jesus was himself an extension of God. The thing is, something interesting is happening at the very same time that the notion of Jesus, the human being, could be looked at through a shift in perspective as Jesus who embodies God. And that is simply what Jesus was saying and what Jesus was doing in his whole life. When we look at who Jesus spent his time with, who he welcomed to the dinner table, who he reached out to and healed, and when we look at what he spoke about in parables, a Samaritan, a shepherd, a wayward son, a widow, there's one consistent thing that Jesus sees within every single person that other people seem to miss. It's almost as if the people around Jesus, including his very own disciples, are gazing at an image on a page of these other people and seeing one thing, one reality. But Jesus will look at that very same person, that same image, and he sees a deeper reality. The reality that holiness, that the very presence of God is already embodied in that person. And because that's true, they should be regarded with the same reverence, the same awe and wonder, the same joy, the same hospitality, the same love that we would if we encountered God. I believe the message of the Gospels and what Jesus points out again and again and again is that God is very much in human form. But not only in the person of Jesus, but in you and in me and in everyone. And I do mean everyone. And our job in life is to recognize that and celebrate that, to take the image that we're presented with, whether it's we're gazing at our own reflection in a mirror, or we're looking at a complete stranger, or we're considering what to do with a person who's let us down, and to allow the shift to occur in our perception that can reveal the glow of sacred that's within that person. The implications for that shift and what we call reality, those implications are staggering. It goes far beyond do unto others as you need to be done to you. It's certainly that. But it's valuing yourself and valuing others as beloveds, beloveds who need to be listened to and regarded as most worthy and valuable and cherished and given the best seat at the table. The Gospels are about, I believe, Jesus pointing out that what was true for him is true for all of us. And we just need to see it as reality. We need transfiguration. One day I was at a hospital visiting a man in intensive care. He had just gone through heart bypass surgery. Now, this man was a member of my church, and he was a hard-charging, take no prisoners kind of guy. The reality was, he could be rather abrupt, and people genuinely feared him. Some folks even said he was mean-spirited. A lot of people just avoided him. But that day in the hospital, as he was hooked up to all kinds of wires and tubes, he told me that this surgery had been a life-changing experience for him. It was humbling. He said it was a real wake-up call. He said that he felt vulnerable and afraid for the first time since he could remember, or at least admit. But the odd thing was, he said, it was in feeling vulnerable and afraid that he had also felt the presence of God within him. It was in a powerful way he really couldn't quite put his finger on, except to say that his fear was replaced with a bright glow of peace. He knew he had this well-earned reputation for getting his way at all costs. He said he was well aware he frequently acted like a bull and a jerk. He knew that a lot of people really didn't like him, but that was how he had gotten things accomplished in the past. He told me he might out of this experience looking exactly the same on the outside, but on the inside, he felt transformed. He said he was no longer going to insist on his own way all the time, that he would listen more, that he would smile more, be more considerate of how other people felt. He was determined to live out a new reality. Now, I had heard that kind of talk before about how someone's going to turn over a new leaf, especially from people under the influence of pain medication. So I told him, I thought, well, that's great. That's a fantastic idea. But personally, I wasn't convinced that he was really going to change his ways. But here's what happened. After he recovered, the weeks and the months went by, everyone was amazed at the change in this man. He was gentle and kind. He smiled a lot. He listened a lot. He would actually admit when he was wrong and that he didn't have all the answers. He no longer played the role of being the smartest guy in the room who was the expert on everything. And that really put people away. He went from being avoided to being embraced. He went from being feared to being revered. He started hugging people, and people hugged him right back. He began laughing a lot. He would cry at the drop of a hat. He enjoyed life and people, and they truly enjoyed him. Folks who'd known him for a long time would look at each other and say, "What happened to that guy?" At first glance, he appeared to be the exact same man, but a remarkable shift had taken place. And for everyone that he knew, their perspective of him had shifted too. What he had embodied all along within him, the presence of God within him, suddenly became evident. It changed the reality of his life and the lives of everyone he knew for the better. For that shift to happen, it doesn't need to be quite as dramatic as open heart surgery. Every day is an opportunity to see beyond our reality, to be challenged to grow in our understanding of who we are and who our neighbor is and what we're called to do about that. You already embody the love, the spirit, the very essence of God today, right now. You glow. I've seen it. And together, we get to do the wonderful work of seeing that reality in everyone and to make sure that they see it in themselves. Amen.